America's hospitals and health systems are at risk of attacks that threaten the bioeconomy. How do these threats affect patients and citizens, and what can we do to help reduce the risks? Welcome to Advancing Health, a podcast brought to you by the American Hospital Association. I'm Tom Petterly, Executive Speechwriter for AHA. We're very privileged to have as our guest today FBI Supervisory Special Agent Edward Yu. Mr. Yu is a former colleague of John Riggi, who now serves as AHA's Senior Advisor for Cybersecurity and Risk, following a nearly 30-year career with the FBI. Mr. Yu is a highly accomplished 17-year veteran of the FBI and one of the nation's leading experts on threats to the bioeconomy. In this podcast, they discuss their work defending hospitals and health systems against the growing danger of high-impact ransomware attacks and cyber espionage campaigns.
Thank you, Tom. Hello, everyone. This is John Riggi from the American Hospital Association, your Senior Advisor for Cybersecurity and Risk. Thanks for joining us again for another episode in our continuing Cyber and Risk podcast series, Frontline Perspective. Today, I'm truly pleased and privileged to have a conversation with my good friend and former colleague at the FBI, Edward Yu. Edward Yu is a highly accomplished and respected supervisory special agent in the FBI's Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate, having just finished a 2-year detail as a liaison officer at the Department of Health and Human Services, Office of National Security. His overall goal is to safeguard the scientific community, the life science research enterprise, and the U.S. bioeconomy. Ed has been directly involved in policy-making efforts with a focus on biosecurity. He served as an active working group member of the White House National Security Council. He is currently a senior fellow for the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. Prior to joining the FBI, Ed had extensive experience in biotechnology studies and academic research. So Ed is nationally recognized as one of the nation's leading experts on threats to the bioeconomy. He was recently featured on CBS's 60 Minutes on a story relating to threats to the bioeconomy. Clearly, Ed is a scientist with a badge and a gun. Ed, so again, thanks for being here with us today, for taking the time. And let's start with the basics, Ed. What is the bioeconomy?
Sure. So before I begin, I just want to say thank you personally for the opportunity. I really do consider it an honor and privilege to be able to spend time with you, and want to acknowledge the members of the AHA and all that you all have been doing in response to the pandemic. Truly appreciate it, and anything that I or the FBI can do in support and protecting your ability to help our patient population, it really is truly important to us and a priority. So thanks for this opportunity. With regards to the bioeconomy, it may be a new term of art, but it's one that is catching on broadly. What it is a healthy recognition of the advances that we're seeing in biotechnology that will have profound impact, not only at an individual level, but at a national or even global level to our economy. And it can translate for our purposes for the AHA in looking at how we can improve healthcare. And when it comes to biotechnology, really it boils down to all about the data. That if you think of all the applications, the tools, the devices that are going to be developed and come online in furtherance of delivering improved healthcare and healthcare outcomes, it's going to be all about the data. Right? Data is going to become the new critical resource or the new oil that is really going to fuel the ability to leverage biotech. And therefore, data, even beyond the traditional cybersecurity issue, is really going to be the focal point, a priority, not only for the US, but for around the world. So again, the bioeconomy is acknowledging the advances that we're seeing in biotech. and the heavy, heavy dependence upon data.
Thanks, Ed. So obviously, when your role is to identify threats and risk to the United States from a national security perspective and direct threats to the bioeconomy. What do you see as the greatest threats to the bioeconomy today, and where do they originate from?
Sure. So if you think about biological threats, historically speaking, the perspective has always boiled down to looking at dangerous bacteria, viruses, or toxins, right? The biological weapon. And with good reason. The U.S. has the unfortunate history of being the only country that was a victim of a bioterrorism attack. When we think about the anthrax mailings on the heels of the 9/11 attacks, and the fact that we are still in the throes of a global pandemic through COVID. So yes, the threat of dangerous pathogens or emerging and re-emerging infectious disease is still a big threat. But as I mentioned before, acknowledging the advances in we're seeing in biotechnology, we absolutely need to expand the scope of what potentially can constitute a threat, and that translate into that if data is the new oil, the new critical resource, then we really need to start thinking about what does security look like for our data. And I'm not talking about privacy. I'm not talking about ransomware. I'm talking about the fact that we may not really truly appreciate the value of the data and not assessing risk appropriately, and maybe not even understanding the consequences of what happens when we lose that data or it gets co-opted or accessed by others, or either state or non-state actors. So that to me is at least the near-term issue, that we just don't understand the scope, and we don't understand the value of our data.
Thanks, Ed. And I think, again, a follow-up from that question is, where do you see the biggest threats originating from on threats to the data?
Yeah. Well, if it's all about the data, then you just take a step back and take a look around the world, and who has access to data, and you'll come to the unfortunate and uncomfortable realization that it's China. That the Chinese Communist Party have put in strategies in place to gain access to the data. So you look at all of the cyber intrusions, right? The hacks that we've seen in healthcare and health insurance, the huge exfiltration of data there, the various attacks that we're still seeing that's ongoing around the world. But here's the problem, right? That's what I classify as the covert or criminal acquisition of data. And even in those instances, I don't think we're assessing the actual threat, meaning that predominantly the focus has been on the loss of personally identifiable information, the possibility for identity theft or for fraud. But if you layer on the fact that data is going to fuel the future of precision health. And like, for example, we translated the DNA sequence of SARS-CoV-2 once we got it, and in short order, within 6 months, we were able to develop the mRNA vaccines. And so that just shows you what the power of what you have with the data. But if you think about the insurance hacks and potential loss of data of individuals, for example, billing codes, right, or the medical information, then that is really valuable data from a health standpoint. That if we're thinking about the tune of millions of individuals, and data that can be interpreted as to identifying their current or prior medical conditions, what treatments had been provided, what drugs had been administered, what the drug course over time may have looked like. That's incredibly valuable data that over time will just gain more value as more is gathered, as more is aggregated, or as we develop the tools to analyze that data. And as I said, that's data that's been actively being stolen. The other side of it is that unfortunately we're giving it away, the data. And what I mean by that is through contracts or collaborations or partnerships, The China has heavily invested in, for example, the DNA sequencing market. They've established institutions that are sometimes they're CLIA accredited or HIPAA compliant, so they're HIPAA covered entities. And because they meet all of our existing U.S. Requirements for privacy and even for clinical compliance, that we may be sending specimens and our data for analysis for clinical testing, and may not be realizing the vulnerability of if our data is being sent, especially if it's overseas, who's going to have access to the data and how is that data potentially going to be utilized. So it goes back to not fully appreciating the value or potentially the long-term consequences of getting access to the data. And again, China over the last few years have been actively investing, merging, or acquiring companies, or acquiring the appropriate certifications and accreditations. They have been making these big, bold strategic moves, and they've been incredibly blatant about it. The Communist Party has laid out large-scale 5-year strategies. Their 13th 5-year strategy absolutely calls out precision health and big data analytics. Their Made in China 2025 initiative, they want to be the global leader in biotech and healthcare. And the list goes on as far as making their strategic aspirations well known.
Very interesting, Ed. There's a couple of things you mentioned I just want to follow up on. Obviously, we're speaking about the Chinese government, not the Chinese people, the many good U.S. citizens and researchers that we have here that contribute to the advancement of medical research and science every day. Also, you mentioned that there are legitimate, can I use legitimate in quotes in a sense, Chinese commercial entities that the U.S. healthcare field is engaged in commercial transactions and voluntarily providing a lot of this data that is highly sought after. Are there companies in the U.S. that are actually backed or sponsored by the Chinese Communist Party that U.S. healthcare entities may not realize that when they're dealing with this particular U.S.-based entity, the information may be going back to the Chinese government?
Right. So the timing of this interview is great in that just a few weeks ago, Reuters came out with an investigative piece where they identified a company called BGI, formerly known as the Beijing Genomics Institute. This goes straight by BGI, and their operations are based in Shenzhen, China. BGI offers a non-invasive prenatal test kit. So rather than mothers undergoing invasive amniocentesis, they just provide a blood sample, which is sent to, again, a CLIA accredited laboratory overseas for processing. And because of the nature of the clinical test kit, it received approval from the European Union. It satisfies GDPR requirements for data privacy. So because it is a quote unquote clinical test. And what Reuters discovered was that although you sign a consent form as a patient, you have to read the fine print, that they abide by Chinese laws, meaning that they identified genetic data from mothers all around the world was getting sent back to Hong Kong and China. Yes, they get their results back, but what that means is that as the data resides in China, the Chinese national government, they have laws in place where they can access that data based on determination if there's a national security need. So you see there's a disparity here, a lack of reciprocity in that we send our data overseas to institutions that on paper look like they meet all of our existing criteria. And many of our health institutions here in the U.S. do their due diligence in assessing, are they a HIPAA-covered entity? Are they a business associate based on the regulations? What they are not doing is assessing, okay, once the data goes over there, what are the regulatory or legal requirements over there, over in China? And so there's a lack of understanding of what the risks and the vulnerabilities are once our data leaves our shores. And to compound that, though, I want to highlight something that you just mentioned, that it's, there's a reason why I focus on the Chinese government and not the people. Because I agree with you that the diversity that we have in our scientific community is a strength of our innovation here in the U.S. But even within China, they're actively collecting data on their own people. That there was a New York Times article that came out 2 years ago where they identified that the Chinese government offered low-cost, almost free health examinations for their population. 36 million Chinese participated in it. And they found out that the government was using the genetic information derived from the clinical samples they collected to identify ethnic Uyghurs. And if you're not aware, Uyghurs are an ethnic minority living in the northwest region of China. They're predominantly Muslim, and the Chinese government have actively been trying to displace them from their homes and their lands. There are tragic reports of how Uyghurs, to the tune of hundreds of thousands of them, have been corralled by the government and placed into re-education camps. There's also, it's well documented how the Chinese government is collecting biometric data on their own population for tracking purposes. So there is even a report where by the year 2025, every single newborn in China will be fully genetically sequenced as soon as they're born. So there's a whole generation whose data is going to be co-opted by the government before they even have a voice. And it's surprising, but you'd be hard pressed to find any Chinese national, the average Chinese citizen is not aware of how much of their data is being taken by the government. So even their own population don't realize that. So the vulnerability of the data is not just about the U.S. or even around the rest of the world, but even the own people living within China don't understand that.
Yeah, amazing and frightening, actually, somewhat Orwellian
Yes.
in the collection of data that the Chinese government is involved in, again, for US citizens potentially and their own citizens. So, in sum, what you're saying is that once US data is stored in China, the Chinese government, by their own laws, have the right to access that data for whatever they deem and define as national security reasons. Is that correct?
That's correct. And it is only a one-way street that, as I mentioned, China has established themselves to be able to tap into data from all around the world through, again, through strategic partnerships, for collaborations, through contracts. But again, based on those very same laws that they have implemented in China, we don't get to see any of their data. It is a one-way street. So that from a bioeconomy standpoint, that gives them a tremendous strategic advantage, that if you are on a path to develop a huge, diverse, multifaceted data set, which theoretically they are on a path to do so, and we don't get to see any of that data, then that gives them a big advantage. And once they are able to develop, artificial intelligence, high performance computing, machine learning, quantum computing, and then turn that loose on that data, then that's how the magic will happen. That's how you're going to be able to determine, diagnoses and improve treatments, develop new pharmaceuticals, develop new healthcare capabilities. Maybe that will translate into co-opting future healthcare market share, new business models. So that's translating into what happens when we don't understand value, that it's not just loss of privacy. It's not theft of intellectual property. It's not even ransomware. It's understanding that it's a potential ticking time bomb, that once they get enough of the data, that they can then turn the biotech tools onto it. They'll be the first to come out with new treatments, the new business models, the new market share. And do we then become marginalized? Does that mean that does that translate into huge talent or job loss here? So it's more than just looking at the theft of IP or innovation, but that can translate into real felt healthcare delivery challenges for us. Does this translate into us becoming healthcare crack addicts and China becoming our pusher? Does that also translate into what, for the coming generation, what job prospects are there going to be for our children's generation by the time they graduate from college, because we were short-sighted in understanding the value of our data?
Ed, great for that detailed response. I also want to just draw out for our listeners that they have to be really cautious on who they provide the data to. Again, population health studies, and as you mentioned, even what may seem as fairly routine data exchanges provided to third parties for billing and coding purposes. There's a lot of valuable information that can be gleaned from that could be used as building blocks for the development of precision medicine. And I would caution our listeners also that, again, to do that due diligence on what you believe to be a US-based third party, understand precisely if they are in fact using subcontractors for that service, which may be located in China or some other foreign nation where the data that you provided them here in the US is then transferred to the subcontractor. And also, we talked about, the China perhaps beating us in this development of precision medicine arms race, if you would use that term. What are the more strategic implications of China becoming dominant economically and scientifically in the development of precision medicine? There is one thing I always like to say is that, as we've seen in the pandemic, health security equals economic security, and economic security equals national security. So tell us your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. I mean, you said it better than I could. But the only thing I would change is that I don't think this is an arms race. We are living in a great power competition. So I look at it as more of a space race, right? It's not just about trying to defeat or slow down the other person or the adversary. It really is, how do you propel yourself to become the global leader? And as I mentioned, through the declarations of Chinese government's these grand national strategies, the heavy investments that we've been seeing over the last few years. Just to kind of give you an example, since the prior presidential administration, there has been more of a scrutiny on looking at foreign investments, and that has translated into a decrease in investments in the U.S. from China. However, those investments that are occurring, the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission actually did a detailed study and report on this. The findings is that although overall Chinese investments in the U.S. has decreased, they have absolutely concentrated more heavily in healthcare and pharmaceutical and biotech industry sectors. So that should be kind of a wake-up call for us. And from a space race standpoint too, this potentially can translate into a win-win-win for China, right? That if they win the bioeconomy space race, they will get improved healthcare, better food security. That will translate into more employment opportunities for their own citizenry. So for the Chinese Communist Party, that's good for them. And then the cherry on top is that the rest of the world becomes beholden to them for, we become dependent upon a foreign supply chain for our healthcare needs. That's what's in it for them. And that's why you're seeing such a heavy emphasis in the biotech space for their priorities.
So Ed, that was a great explanation of what the threat is, what the strategic implications of this threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party. But I think fundamentally, we need to know as a field, as a sector, what can we do to mitigate these threats, especially given there may not be viable, commercial, cost-effective alternatives in the US for the great services that China is providing. They're providing us the platform to make it easy and cost-effective for us to give away the data, as you said. What can we do, Ed?
Right. So first off, we're already doing right now, and which I can't thank you enough, is raising awareness, right? I'm going to be dating myself here, but if I quote from G.I. Joe, knowing is half the battle, right? And having that awareness, having the wherewithal to start improving your risk assessment, doing a due diligence on as you establish contracts or those business partnerships and collaborations, asking about those contractors as subcontractors, doing a better job in understanding where the data might be going, and at least giving the institutions a chance to understand the data flow and being able to conduct a more robust risk assessment. That can help a lot. So you already mentioned it. Of some of the things that we already have, things that we can do right now is great. So just more awareness raising, doing that gut check, and looking at your business model and business operations, and you know, please know that you're not alone in this. That you have the FBI as well. That in each of our field offices we have positions that offer support to the healthcare industry. We have our weapons of mass destruction coordinators who specialize in biosecurity matters. We have InfraGard coordinators to assist in cybersecurity matters, and private sector coordinators to help with potential IP theft or espionage issues as well. So the FBI is there to provide assistance with threat assessments, and also in the case of an event, a criminal event, they're there to help with the response. We also have our other federal partners like the National Counterintelligence Security Center for awareness raising and for training, DHS CISA for other cybersecurity matters too. The fact is that there are potential for public-private partnerships to be able to identify and mitigate the risks. What's also important to note too is that if we understand what we're facing, then it's the institutions, the membership of the AHA, they're best positioned to understand the lay of the land, right? That if you are now able to look at what are these vulnerabilities, where are the unhealthy dependencies that we have in our healthcare system, let us know, because what that does is we'll be able to affect countermeasures, but more importantly, that will help inform policy, right? That either through the government agencies or through AHA, for example, bring that up to the policymakers to help them understand what the challenges, what the limitations are, because not only does that potentially translate into looking at better counters, but there already is policies that are in the works right now, both in the White House and in Congress, and looking at how do we better reinforce and improve the U.S.'s bioeconomy. So to me, that the fact that that's happening is a huge home run. So it's raise awareness, get more eyes on the problem, establish those partnerships with the FBI and others, and get your voices heard. And getting understanding, helping us even within the FBI to understand what is happening on the ground. So I hope that helps.
It does, Ed. As always, I appreciate your candidness, your openness, and willingness to cooperate with the private sector. As you know, that was my role to build those bridges
Right.
when I was at the FBI and in cyber division as the private sector lead liaison. So, but we'll also be, as you said, pretty loud and vocal on behalf of our members, advocating that the government develop other specific policies to subsidize cost-effective alternatives for genetic sequencing and other services that we rely on China for at the moment. Develop those here in the U.S., in a sense, buy American, research American, following those themes. Truly a national security threat, an issue for us. Ed, just as we're winding down here, any last thoughts before we conclude today?
Just want to reiterate what I said at the beginning, just to thank you for this opportunity and the AHA members for what they're doing, especially in response to the COVID pandemic. We're definitely all in this together. I thank you. My family thanks you for everything that you've done. And it really is our mission to ensure not just the bioeconomy success, but something that I mentioned to senior leadership in the federal COVID response was that it's not just about succeeding, it's about winning. And it's not just from a winning from an economic standpoint, but it's winning for the health of our patient population. It's winning for the generation to come, for their, for their prospects and for their future. So can't thank you enough for the opportunity to be able to share this perspective and hopefully raise awareness and give people that added vigilance as we move forward together.
Thank you, Ed. Truly appreciate your gracious, as always, comments and your willingness to be here and share your incredibly valuable insights. Ed, we want to thank you and all the men and women of the FBI for what you do every day to keep the nation safe and the risks that you take. And thanks to all our healthcare listeners for what you do and have done during the pandemic to care for our patients and keep our communities safe. This has been John Riggi, your senior advisor for cybersecurity and risk. Stay safe, everyone.